A number of times on this channel I've mentioned that I really enjoy it when I get a recommendation from one of you guys, or maybe more than one person, for a horror movie or a monster flick or a B-movie even, which I haven't heard of before, something which is a bit more obscure perhaps, to check out on the channel. I love those occasions, it's great, and this, along with a couple of others which we've already talked about and which we are still going to in the future as well, fall under that category. And of course, with personal preference and different pre-existing ideas that people go into the same movie with, different people will almost always have a different result in how they feel about a certain film. And of course that's the case with movies that I've checked out. I've checked out super obscure horror movies which I didn't expect to be very good that were way better than I was expecting. Something for instance like Rubber or Black Mountainside. But then of course on the other side of that coin fall movies which maybe are more popular. For me, something like maybe Halloween or Friday the 13th. Not that they're bad films or even bad franchises, I'm just not a fan of them. I don't have the love for those franchises, which many people do, even though I am a horror fan, and horror as an overarching genre is my favourite genre. So, of course, when you go into these films, it's always going to be different for many people. Now, with this movie, I feel that that could definitely be the case, because this is one of those horror films which I would say you definitely need to go into as an existing fan of this kind of genre. And you could say that that goes without saying, but not really, because there are certain horror films which you can go into regardless of if you're a horror fan and just enjoy it because it's a good movie. For instance, something like Alien, it transcends the genre, as do many others. This particular movie though, called Proteus, doesn't really fall under that category though. This is more so under the category for people who are already fans of these kind of movies, who get the in-jokes and the homages and the references and fully appreciate what the movie is trying to do, what it's paying tribute to, and sometimes what it might fall short of, even though it's got the best intentions or has a good heart, if you will. I would say that that's the case for me with Proteus. Now, the essential plot of this movie, because it's certainly not one of the best known that we've discussed, even among obscure ones, it is super obscure, is it's basically The Thing combined with Peter Benchley's Creature on an oil rig. That's the essential concept. So, similarly to something like Leviathan, which is kind of an amalgam of a couple of other films put together, this definitely has potential, just like Leviathan does. And although, of course, Leviathan isn't that well received, or wasn't that well received at the time for sure, but even to this day, mostly, that is an occasion where it works. It's just not well received for whatever reasons. This one, on the other hand, well, it doesn't quite fall into that same category, at least for me. Not that this is a bad film, not at all. And of course the fact that I'm reviewing it at all at least means, as with any movie on this channel, that I would recommend checking it out at least once, by definition, because I don't review movies that I believe aren't worth watching. So with that in mind, what did this film do well? And perhaps where did it fall short? Of course, as always, without spoiling anything. Well, some of the things that I did really like about Proteus were the special effects. They are almost entirely practical, done with animatronics, puppetry. I'm not sure if there are any miniatures or not, there could well have been. But it was very well done. I really liked that. I was actually surprised when I saw the first occurrence of practical creature effects, which is relatively early on in the film, and they are very Leviathan or The Thing-esque, which put a smile on my face straight away, and they're actually well done. They looked good, and they actually stood out so much because they were better than the films surrounding it and the characters surrounding it. Now, speaking of those characters, the characters is one of the ways that I feel for many people this movie will fall short. Because the actors and the casting and the way they portray the characters actually isn't bad at all. They're really good, actually, across the board. Certainly, I would say, above a lot of other horror movies which I've seen, where the characters are just grating and irredeemable, oftentimes. Just mean-spirited people that you don't really care if they live or not. Like the majority of the people, for instance, in the Saw franchise. They are literally just there to be fodder. They're there to die. In other movies, though, such as, say, The Thing, which of course I reference a lot on the channel because it's the gold standard of the genre, there are people who you do want to live. You want them to do well. This movie, I do think, has those characters. However, I would say that the actors and the casting is good, Not incredible, not mind-blowing, but certainly good enough. It's more so what they've got to work with that slightly lets them down, because that could have been a lot better. Not just in terms of dialogue, but certain characters, there are two in particular, one male, one female, who are written in such a way that they're just annoying. They serve no purpose in the plot, they're just annoying. And you could literally completely remove these two people from the film entirely, and it would make no difference. In fact, it would make a difference, there would be 2 less people to die. So kind of spoiler alert, but considering I didn't mention who the characters were, it's not too much of a spoiler. Plus, once you start watching the movie, you'll fairly quickly probably guess who I'm talking about. Now, the more, not in-depth plot, but slightly more in-depth than what I mentioned earlier, is that these group of people, relatively young people, are drug smugglers, basically. They're trying to get cheaper drugs out of a certain country into a different country by way of the sea. And they have some mishaps which cause them to end up basically not being able to go anywhere. But thankfully, a body washes up next to them in their little dinghy, and they conclude that, of course, someone must be nearby. So they start looking around and see an oil rig, or at least that's what it looks like. So they go on board and they fairly quickly find out that it's not really an oil rig, it's actually a test facility. Surprise, surprise. Which, incidentally, I had no idea, but it's actually very similar to what I pitched for, I believe it was The Thing versus the Blob, or The Thing versus Splinter, I can't recall which Ultimate Fights it was, where I thought it would be a good idea to set that storyline on a fake oil rig, which was actually a research station. So, of course, it's not the most original idea in the world. This one had already done it. I'm sure others had even earlier as well. It is a concept which definitely has potential, and it was pretty cool for me to see that, given that I'd had independently the same idea for a different concept. So they go into this environment, they quickly find that there's not many people around, and the people who are around are not quite right. They're just that little bit off, and in some cases quite far off, but you tend to see that more as the audience than they do as characters, which again is a trope of the genre. You tend to get an insight as the viewer, which the characters themselves don't have. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm talking about this film as if it were just like Splinter or Harbinger Down or The Blob or any of these others that I talk about a lot. Don't go into this movie expecting the same kind of quality as many of the other films which I praise and which I recommend. It categorically does not have that level of quality. If you go into this movie expecting the world, you will most definitely be disappointed, because the opening camera work, the opening sound quality is horrendous. It gets a little bit better once they're on the oil rig, or the rig, but even then, the camera work isn't great, the sound quality, and in particular the sound mix, is definitely off. The talking is far quieter than everything else, which means that when you turn the TV up to hear them talking, it will suddenly have a loud blaring noise or a music swell, which is very annoying, at least for me. So, it's definitely not perfect, not even close, it's very much so a B-movie, and there are certain others, of course, which we've talked about, which are also B-movies, but it's not difficult to elevate a movie beyond the B-movie genre. Even Alien itself is essentially a B-movie, it's just a really well-made one. As I've said before, and as other people have mentioned, it's a B-movie done A, so you can do that. This one, though, is very much so a B-movie, and in some ways, this is more like a B-movie done C, if you want to think of it that way, because it is under par, unfortunately. Now, in terms of stuff which I specifically did not like, or even potentially hated, because that can sometimes happen, I wouldn't say I hated anything in particular. There were some jarring things, such as convenient plot points all over the place, vehicles, for instance, which appear out of nowhere, and just things which happen purely to service the plot, which don't make much sense, aplenty. That happens all over the place. And if that's the kind of thing that ruins a film for you, you probably won't like this, because there's quite a few of those convenient things, both in a good and a bad way. But it didn't ruin it for me. I expected it. As soon as I saw the visual quality, I kind of knew what I was in for, and I tried to embrace that and to see the good. So this is definitely a movie that, as I said, you need to have that appreciation for. If you're just an average horror fan, you'll probably despise this film. But if you can appreciate a good monster movie, and especially appreciate a movie which is trying to be good, but just doesn't succeed, that's almost admirable. At least their heart was in the right place. And I would definitely say that Proteus had its heart in the right place, for sure. If I didn't feel that way, I wouldn't have even bothered reviewing it at all. So with that being said, there was nothing that I absolutely hated, but there was plenty that could have been done better, all over the place. In fact, pretty much every aspect of the film could have been done a lot better. So it really is the essential core value and the core concept which redeems it for me. In a similar way to something like Altitude, which is one of the lowest rated movies I've ever done, but I still reviewed it because it actually had a pretty clever idea. It just carried it out in a very bad way. So with all of that being said, what about the scores? Because a movie like this could be interesting. It could be super low, it could be average. Not much of a chance of it being high, of course, so let's take a look. First of all, we have, as always, the story and the plot. And as I said, this movie does underperform in a lot of ways, and at best it tends to just be okay, rather than great. There is, however, one score which I am going to rate a little bit higher than you might expect, and you can probably guess which one that is given the genre. But first of all, for the story and plot, I'm going to give it a 4, because it definitely is that little bit under par. And I've mentioned it before, but for those who are maybe new to the channel, all of my movies start with a 5 out of 10, even before I've seen it. That's my baseline. So basically you can think of it like a fuel gauge that can swing either way. If it swings higher than a 5, then it's doing well. If it swings lower, then it's underperforming. So for me, a 4 out of 5 indicates exactly what I feel. It wasn't awful, and I'm talking just about the story here. If you remove everything else and just consider the essential concept and how that concept is unpacked and carried out, then yeah, it was under par, but not by much. It was a good essential idea, which, as I said earlier, just wasn't carried out in the absolute best way. As far as the characters go, their motivations, the casting, that kind of stuff, well, once again, I'm going to give it another 4, because they are definitely under par. 2 in particular, as I said, are straight up pointless. They could have been used a lot better. You could have easily made everyone in this film people who you do care about, because technically they are criminals, as I said earlier, they're drug smuggling, but there are plenty of people in plenty of films who aren't good people, but you can still get behind them. The Hateful Eight, for instance, none of them are good people, but it's a great story and you do care about them all. So it could have easily been a lot better. There's one primary character in this movie who's kind of like the MacReady of this story, a British chap, and he's probably the best part of the cast, but that's the way it's supposed to be. All of the focus is on him, although, kind of mini spoiler alert, he gets smacked around a lot in this movie, and if you've already seen this film, you probably know exactly what I mean. He gets smacked around a lot in this movie, and considering he's the biggest guy of the bunch, it's kind of humorous every time that happens. And also even more humorous that he doesn't learn from it after the second or third time he gets thrown into a wall, that maybe he should have a slightly different approach or not put his gun down, for instance, when he's talking to someone that he doesn't know. But still, as far as the visuals though, this is the way that I am going to rate it a little bit higher than par, because I am going to give it a 6, and that is easily the most generous score that I'm willing to give to this film. And some people, I feel, probably won't agree with that 6. They will definitely think it's too high, and I can totally understand that. And the only reason why I am giving it a 6, as I mentioned earlier, is because of the type of movie which it is. Most of us go into these monster flicks expecting one thing, and that is a good monster, a good concept, a good creature with potentially a good backstory or lore carried out in a visually appealing way. Now, you can totally fail at that if the rest of the film is good, but if it's a bad movie, or at least an under par one, as many of these horror flicks are, then a good monster can definitely save a bad film. So here I would say that that is partially the case. The monster goes through different forms, there are very Thing-esque sequences, also as I mentioned at the start of the video, some very Peter Benchley's Creature-esque moments, especially toward the end, and I liked that. I did actually really like the creature designs, and they were so much better than the rest of the film. It was very clear that they put pretty much all of their effort into that, and probably most of the budget as well. But I can't knock them for that. That's where it should have gone. They should have written it better, but still, as far as budget goes, yeah, make it a good creature, and they did. It was practical, it looked great for the most part actually, but at the same time, it's a very dark film a lot of the time. I don't mean in terms of the content, but just the visuals. You just can't see what's going on sometimes. And also, as I said, the opening looks horrendous. I don't know why. The quality is much lower at the start of the movie. Maybe they filmed it on a different camera. Looks like it was filmed on something like a cardboard tube with a potato inside. It just doesn't work at the start. It looks horrendous. So definitely just bear with the movie for about the first 5 minutes, because the first 5 minutes is probably the worst of all in terms of visual and audio quality, and it does get better after that. As far as the audio though, I am actually going to give it a 5, which is on par, because although the audio at the start in particular is definitely under par and the sound mix is off for sure, it does have a pretty good score and a pretty good soundtrack, a surprisingly good one actually. I did like the theme, and overall the creature effects sounded good enough, more than good enough. The dialogue could be heard. It was basically just the sound mixing that was off. If you're actually totally honest about it, which of course I'm trying to be, I can't really knock it too badly for the sound. It wasn't great, but it was really just one issue, and that was, to be fair, the same issue that Interstellar has, which is probably my favourite Nolan film, but the sound mix is way off in that movie in the exact same way. People are mumbling, and then the music is crazy loud. I don't knock that movie for it, so it wouldn't be fair to do that to this one either. So I am going to give it a 5, which works out to be on par. As far as the fun factor and the rewatchability finally, well actually once again, perhaps surprisingly, I am actually going to give it another 5. Now I was torn, to be honest, between a 4 and a 5 for this one, because a 5 is, to be clear, very generous. It's not a bad film, I wouldn't say. However, I do think that some people would say this is a bad film. And although I don't agree with that, fundamentally, I can totally get why they would say that. If they're not a horror fan of this type of movie, and I don't mean bad movies, I mean monster movies, then they just won't get it. They won't get why those of us who do love these movies love them so much. So it doesn't have a universal rewatchability for sure, not even close, but at the same time it is definitely a movie which I feel inclined to watch again. And actually, that surprises me. I didn't expect to want to revisit this movie, but I'm now 2 days on, and I do feel like watching it again. And especially if I was going to watch it with someone else to show them, somebody else who also has, say, an affinity with monster movies and appreciates them. Apart from that, it's very limited. It is actually pretty good for a group rewatching though, because it is a fundamentally silly concept, so it's actually pretty good for a party, but at the same time you can have a lot of fun ragging on the bad quality all over the place of certain things. So yeah, it definitely has a fun factor, and all of that added up kind of equals it out really to a 50%, or a 5 out of 10, which is exactly what I'm giving it. And overall that means that as a tabulation of those 5 categories all put together, I'm giving it a just under par 2.4 out of 5, which is actually not a bad score. I think that's probably quite a lot better than many people would give this movie. I feel like a lot of people would probably give this the equivalent of a 2, maybe even lower, but I definitely don't think that it deserves to be that low. And to give you some perspective, a 2.4 for this movie means that I'm giving it the exact same score that I gave to Shakma, the killer baboon movie, and I feel that that's pretty accurate. In different ways they do kind of equal each other. They're not the same in any particular way, but in terms of the way I scored them, they do have some similarities, and I'm happy with the 2.4 overall. So this is a movie which, if you are a fan of the kind of movies which I review, is definitely worth a look, but I would also at the same time say go into this movie expecting more TV movie level quality than a normal movie, and also accept the fact that it is very much so a B movie, but in the lower grade of the B movie in terms of the way it's done, but in potentially the higher grade for potential. This is a prime occasion where I would say that I would like to see this movie remade better, because it has a ton of potential there, and if it was done right, this really could be up there with the most iconic ones of the genre. So overall, yeah, give it a look. Go into it with measured expectations, or even lowered expectations, and you might just find something to love. Or at the very least, to find entertaining. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.